We have achieved great things. We have made giant leaps. We've gone far beyond what we thought was possible. But we have only just begun. Our future in space is unlimited, and it will benefit all humanity. But it will take hard work, new technologies, advanced financing models, and enabling public policy. The Beyond Earth Institute is creating a policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We will engage all stakeholders on critical policy issues: property rights in space, norms of behavior, conflict resolution protocols, filling the technology gaps, exploring new financing mechanisms, and making space settlement an agreed goal of the U.S. and its allies. Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.
Good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Sean Hadley. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of the Beyond Earth Institute. And I want to wish everyone a warm welcome to our program today, which looks at the vexing challenge of paving the rules of the road towards space migration. So I first, of course, want to thank our amazing group of experts gathered here who will be introduced shortly by our president. But before that, I just want to share a couple of housekeeping items and some exciting Beyond Earth updates. And of course, I want to thank those of you who provide a contribution to our program today. Thank you so much. It is so critically important for our mission that you support Beyond Earth with a financial donation. So, and if you haven't already, please take a moment, go to our website, beyondearth.org, and make a donation. Again, it is greatly appreciated. So for those of you joining us, this is a 90-minute program, and we're going to get that underway in just a second after some news. First of all, I want to share that we are really excited about launching the Beyond Earth Leadership Council, which is going to serve as a main way of our engagement with stakeholders. And what's really exciting about this opportunity is that we are going to talk with leaders about ways to refine our priorities, get needed input, and really serve as also a networking opportunity for our council to help move our mission forward with really good recommendations coming out of that collaboration. So we are also really excited to announce that the Beyond Earth Institute is going to launch in the fall of this year, the Beyond Earth Policy Journal. And we are so excited to be able to have a regular publication that brings together all of the fantastic work that is being done in helping our mission for long-term human presence in space. And so we'll have more information on that very shortly. But in some just even more recent news, we have also just on February 9th signed the Washington Compact. This was sponsored by the Hague Institute. And this sets us on a mission very related to what we're going to talk about in just a minute for setting up those norms of behavior that we're looking at, the rules of the road. How do we pave these rules of the road? And so we're very excited about this being a recent signatory along with many other dignitaries and our continued and soon collaboration with the Hague Institute on partnering on how to make this happen. So again, we are very excited. We are focused on these policy solutions. Short term, we want to accomplish these goals for a long-term human presence. And we are thinking more, not just what we have to do now, but what we need to do to get to that next step. And part of that for today, of course, is these rules that we need to ensure that human access doesn't work just next year, doesn't just work in 5 years, but works in the long run. So short-term goals for long-term success. So we at Beyond Earth see this future that is going to be filled with economically vibrant communities living and working beyond planet Earth. And we really want to make this happen. And we're going to have this fascinating conversation today to talk about one important step for us to get there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today's program, who is going to introduce our distinguished speakers today. And so let me turn it now to our president and CEO, Steve Wolf.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much, Sean. It is, that's a great way to set up this conversation. It has been so exciting to see all of the things that are coming together for the Beyond Earth Institute. Always reminded about the numbers of individuals, professionals and interns and students that have committed time and sweat equity into helping to build, what we've been able to do over these past 3 years. And this year is going to be even bigger than we've done before. So thanks again. This discussion that we're about to get into with these amazing individuals, in this discussion, we're about to have we think is particularly relevant to the mission of the Beyond Earth Institute. So the Beyond Earth Institute we're about blazing a policy pathway in the immediate future that will enable the potential for civilizations to expand beyond Earth in the coming years and decades. Quite often, we like to say that, if we only had a space settlement goal, then that would be a guiding principle for all of our space efforts, right? We'd like to have this goal, but while a space settlement goal would be ideal, and we tried to do that in 1988 with the Space Settlement Act. A goal in and of itself is not enough, right? Is a goal for ending world hunger, or dealing with climate change, or dealing with gun violence. Is that enough? Of course not. We need to have effective and meaningful action to back up those goals, and not just one-offs, but something that's sustainable over time, so that we can move towards that goal that we want. So today I'm very excited because we're discussing a proposal that would provide specific mechanisms that can move our nation and the world by extension towards this space migration future. And this proposal is not just about setting a general goal or adopting some language that would be inserted in an authorization bill. It would integrate space migration intention into the fabric of cross-government operations year after year. And that's really what it's all about. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion. So let's get into it, okay? First, I want to ask Cody if he could put into the chat field links to the paper that we're going to be discussing today, Emerging Space Industry Ecosystem Leading to Eventual Beyond Earth Migration, as well as the Washington Compact that Sean spoke about just a moment ago. Okay, and then of course, everyone, please post your questions into the chat field, and we will get to as many of those as we can. We want to really get your engagement on this discussion. Okay, so now to the panel. What I want to do is I want to introduce all three panelists and then invite them in, and then we'll get into this conversation. First is Courtney Stad. He is the Beyond Earth's Executive Vice President, and he's the founder and president of the Capital Alliance Solutions. For over 40 years, Courtney has been a government and private sector champion for the removal of policy and regulatory barriers to the emergence of the commercial space marketplace. He's held senior positions at the Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, in the White House, at the National Space Council. He's also served 3 NASA administrators. It's no stretch at all to say that the current blossoming of the commercial space sector right now is due to a large part to the efforts that Courtney has made over the years. Next is Bob Brumley. Bob is a Beyond Earth advisor. We're very glad to that. He is a senior managing director at Marble Arch Partners, and serves as chairman and CEO of the Laser Light Companies. Before launching a very successful career in telecom, which included senior executive positions at Deutsche Telekom and Bell Atlantic International, which is now Verizon, Bob was Ronald Reagan's chief legal officer at the Department of Commerce in the 80s, and he chaired Ronald Reagan's policy working group that originally privatized commercial space transportation. You know, we are very fortunate and welcome the depth and knowledge and insight that Bob brings to this subject matter and the challenges that Beyond Earth is trying to address. And finally, John Neal is with us, and he is the executive director of for space policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. John's career includes spending nearly 10 years at the FBI as a special agent. I don't think they could tell us what he did there, but I'm sure it's interesting. He also served on active duty in the Pacific and the Middle East for the U.S. Navy. He was a legislative affairs person for both the FBI and the Navy. And more recently, John served as a senior professional staff member to the House Committee on Homeland Security. In the private sector, John held a number of business development positions, including most recently with Planet Labs. So he's got space chops as well. And John, thank you certainly thank you for your service. And it is a great pleasure to have you as part of this conversation. So with that, I want to let's get into this. Let's get into this right away, and let's start with the topic of this discussion. And I'm going to look for responses from each of you as a way of kind of folks getting to know you a bit as we engage here. So the topic is paving the rules of the road towards space migration. Gosh, I mean, it is. We have to agree that space migration is a long way off. No kidding. So why is it important to place our discussion today in such a long-term context?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is the fact that when Bob, and I should emphasize that Bob is sort of, I regard him as my blood brother. He was my mentor and has been for almost 40 years. I learned a great deal about working the government industry connection from working with Bob. What we motivated us way back when, I'm going back almost 30 for 40 years, was if we managed to get the government to take its metaphorical foot off the neck of the entrepreneur, that you would unleash this tremendous market-driven power. We started that with preventing NASA in the wake of Challenger from going back to launching commercial payloads. And over a period of time, that resulted in the industry you see today. But you've also seen this incredible entrepreneurial spirit to the point that you have nearly 10,000 companies, at least and growing, in the world, in the entrepreneurial world, some of which are paper companies and those who are building hardware in the full range of the space ecosystem. You have about $6.5 billion over the past year that private venture money has been invested. That's significantly lower than what was the case a year or two prior, but a little minor thing called pandemic and other economic winds entered the picture. Plus, as Bob will tell you, he lives that world. These tranches of money come in waves, but there's a tremendous amount of private sector money. So even if you extract the government, which is still a critical player in the commercial world, there is a sort of independent life, if you will, that hopefully we'll get into further in this discussion that we're seeing. And so we're actually witnessing the beginnings, the tangible, practical beginnings of off-planet migration as we speak. Starting low Earth orbit, several commercial habitats. We're seeing a whole number of people laying the groundwork for cislunar as well. That's why we felt it was important to develop this paper and these recommendations that we'll get into a little bit.
Great. And Bob, why don't you pick up on that, what Courtney just said, expand on it.
Yeah, I think to try to reduce this really broad topic into kind of a one word, the word is investment. Now, when you hear investment, we all think of private investment, but there's also public investment. There's also social investment. And when you break it down that way, how committed, ergo invested, are we socially, publicly, privately, in what would be the goal? And in this case, a migration of humankind off planet. The investment part, if you break it into those three pieces, ironically, and we found this out in the Reagan administration, and I forgive everyone here who thinks the Reagan administration was, 50 years ago, and let's move on with it. I agree with you. I like to move on with it on my resume as well, but people mention it anyway. When you look at it, this government has multiple departments and agencies whose job is either to regulate and or invest in what would be their particular subject matters and their area of responsibility, whether it be commerce, transportation, treasury, state, et cetera. It's when we as a community, public and private, start thinking of off-planet as merely an extension of all those responsibilities of those various departments and agencies, will we get out of a single mindset that I have to sell a product to DoD for me to be able to get financing. I have to get a Space Act agreement from NASA for me to be able to be taken credibly in the capital markets. Instead, the Treasury Department can deal with what would be in industrial revenue bonds for projects in space. Commerce has Economic Development Authority to do what would be investments in communities on this planet that want to do things off planet. Spaceport comes to mind. There's infrastructure money. We now have more infrastructure money rattling around after the IRA was passed. That is still looking for shovel-ready projects. This country has invested in what now could be investments in not only off-planet activity, but it's being matched and in some cases challenged by investment by private sector firms, whether it be Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, or VCs, or high net worth individuals, or globally sovereign funds. So kind of taking it back, Steve, to the overall arching view here, is this country invested?
Right.
And
I
if
love
it
that.
is invested, is it doing the work that has to come with being invested? Because that would make us committed. And I think over the course of this program, we can kick that around.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. Actually, I love the way you put that in context, that it is about investment. Investment takes many shapes and colors, but it really is, what are we willing to invest in? Not just in the short term, but in the long term. John, you are relatively new to this conversation. And so it's particularly exciting that you decided that you accepted our invitation to engage in this conversation. So therefore, I'm interested in your take on this when we talk about things like space migration as an extension of space commerce over time.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. And thanks for this opportunity. And to sort of build on Bob's comments, if I was to reduce it, or the Chamber of Commerce was to reduce it, why it is, more active in this space, in this industry, it's one word, is commerce, right? Its member companies are, the long range view that the people in the Reagan administration, our predecessors, put into, work, decades ago, has really come to fruition over the last 10 to 15 years here. And we have a viable commercial industry, everything from the chamber, the big contractors that, we're all familiar with, who, build Artemis and other spacecraft, to, startup companies that are, leveraging data or building new products and services derived from space. And we have a viable industry when it comes to SATCOM or remote sensing data or space flight that's generating revenue and creating jobs. And the Chamber sees an enormous opportunity for that to grow over the next 10, 20 years that, it wants to support. And I think, to Bob's point about investment, I think where the Chamber, one of the things that we want to be active is, how can we connect and activate the public, and help them, help my parents, right, understand better, like, what remote sensing data, how that impacts their lives, from the food they eat to, disaster recovery. How does SATCOM, address broadband deficits in remote areas of the country and globally? so that they will understand, that this growing industry really does matter, and it's not just a one-off event when we see, a launch or something like that. And by activating, more of the public, hopefully, again, we get more people invested, as Bob said.
Yeah, and let's stay on that for a second, John. I mean, it's so exciting, the extent to which the chamber is embracing this vision, and it's it certainly is parallel to so many other sectors now that are recognizing the true economic potential of space development. You're talking about certainly about the LEO environment with satellites, communications, Earth observation. The potential there, we've only just begun in that realm alone. Never mind looking out to say something like cislunar. But it's interesting you're mentioning that that the chamber has a strong public-facing interest in this as well. I mean, could you speak to any specific activities or programs that they're engaging in to sort of get this message out, or is that still forming?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, we're still forming, but I think, if we think about the chamber's advocacy role, with Congress and the administration, how can we activate, there's a certain core group of interests in space, on Capitol Hill, and obviously the requisite agencies that regulate space. But how can we activate groups within the Treasury Department, the Department of Agriculture, their oversight and appropriators on Capitol Hill to again help them understand the commercial opportunities by the LEO economy and deep space exploration, establishing a permanent presence on the moon. How do we, again, help them understand the competition we're in with adversary countries like China, for example, and help them understand why space is important, but bring it back home to them to understand this is a great job. There's a lot of great jobs being created that touch all levels of society. There's wealth and economic opportunities, in every community across the country. Space is not just limited to, certain, whether it's California or Florida, some of those core centers. There's companies supplying components and parts to these endeavors that are located in every town in America, I would argue. So helping people understand why space is important and the opportunity it presents. That's where I think the chamber can be really active. So doing workshops, again, walking the halls of the Capitol, talking to the administration, and then finally, I would say, how does the chamber help create the conditions for U.S. businesses to operate and compete globally? And to Bob's point, thinking about relieving those regulatory burdens, getting, hurdles out of the way that, our companies that are growing and really innovating can go out and sell products and services.
That's so exciting because, the chamber could be such an accelerant in this regard to get these messages out there. To support, the space industry on all levels. Certainly there's that business component, but also there's it also ultimately comes down to a quality of life issue for all Americans or people around the world that are fully taking advantage of these capabilities. So thanks for that. That's exciting to hear. Let me move, if I can, and address this to Bob, and start to move into this rules of the road conversation we're going into. Now, Bob, we've talked quite a bit about this, and you talk about, on one hand, that we need rules of the road that can help to guide us into the future and leading us ultimately to migration. On the other hand, you also stress that there are plenty of good laws on the books that we just need to be applying in the right way that can help to foster and accelerate our activities in space. I'm really interested in how these sort of differing ideas sort of mesh with you and in your thinking.
Yeah, they're all the same idea in a sense. I'm into one word openings. So, and from investment, I'll give you another one word opening on this topic: certainty. And that is a big word, especially in the financial community. But it's also a big word relative to not just deployment of capital, but also deployment of potentially intellectual property, deployment of what would ultimately will be people into habitation. We do have lots of laws in this country. I'm going to stick my neck out, and I still believe that every space-related contract for products and services that has been entered into in history has all been essentially under U.S. law or U.S. contracting for U.S. firms. In other words, there's no space law to contract with to do commercial code. It's a U.S. contract with a U.S. vendor, or it's a U.S. contract with a French vendor, but it's all governed by, in the body of the contract, jurisdiction, dispute resolution, recognized norms. So how do you balance that with going off planet? As you go off planet, you take all the hundreds of years of negotiations and state laws and then international norms with you. You take it with you. You don't create a brand new code for space. You just make the current code on this planet applicable to it. And by doing that, you achieve certainty. And then certainty comes with it a core value or core benefit, and that's relevance. Because with certainty, I know now that if I build something and it violates, let's say, one of the trade laws, what's going to happen is that a competitor, French, German, or Chinese, or someone else, will seek remedy under the trade laws if we extend the trade laws into this environment. That allows you to have forums for dispute resolution. It allows you to go to an international arbitrator and a whole variety of things. Are we there yet? Marginally not, because government dominates a lot of this activity right now. But as Courtney pointed out, and John pointed out, John's constituency is going to go to John and they're going to say, what are the tax rules? What are the rules relative to product liability? You know, we had everyone freaked out about the balloon here a little while ago, but the result is what if the balloon actually dropped on someone's house in Montana? Who's going to pay for that? And believe it or not, there's actually people who are really going to want to get paid for that, or else get paid to go find out about it. These are not tiny little issues. These are little straws, little threads in the overall quilt that we basically call certainty in terms of both investment and conduct, both on planet and off planet.
I love the way you put that these are threads in a tapestry of certainty. But I can't help putting you on the spot and asking you, do you see a particular area that is particularly ripe that needs particular attention more than, say, other areas?
Sure. Three of the biggest and hottest areas that are commented on LinkedIn, for example, or in other forums, is property rights, our property rights, dispute resolution, insurance, application, intellectual property. I will say there's probably more intellectual property theft going on now that is sort of reminiscent of the good old days when everybody was a gunslinger and you could basically sign an NDA and then forget it. But that's a sign of actually of robustness of ideas. It's also a robustness of bad behavior, particularly among certain nation states. So those are right now, those are on everybody's lips. And whether lawyers are talking about outer space treaty application or lawyers are talking about property rights, little by little, you're seeing people say, I'm going to go without the rules. I'm going to use the rules in Canada on mining, and I'll say they apply to me because I'm Canadian, and somebody can sue me over it, but I'll see them somewhere else in a Canadian court. That's just human nature. That's the way we operate. And so, kind of wrapping up that idea, I really think those are the hot topics: intellectual property, property rights themselves, dispute resolution, and then lastly is sort of the general regulatory environment on investment requirements.
Thanks, Bob. Actually, and it's interesting, those happen to be the top of the list of the Beyond Earth Institute to look into and try to tackle from a policy standpoint. Let me move on to you, Courtney, and certainly give you an opportunity to respond to what's been said. But you've helped to shape this policy over the years, right? I would say that we've reached a new threshold, right? Or I shouldn't say threshold, plateau right? In terms of we've kind of come afar a certain distance. We're on a plateau. What do you think? And what do you think we need to do to go beyond this? It may be just saying I agree with Bob, but maybe you can expand on that a bit. What do we need to do going forward?
Well, let me also add to what Bob was saying. When we were talking about parts of this paper, including the reference in the paper to the Western expansion of the US in the 19th century, it became very clear as I was hearing Bob lay out the government role in terms of the Homesteading Act, the role of the cavalry, the US military, the role of the legal system at the time, that really many of those elements were fundamental to the successful expansion of the frontier as we know it. And although it's a cliche to make reference to the Western frontier and the so-called high frontier of space, I think our paper really fleshes out the fact that it's a very practical analogy, and you heard Bob flesh out some of those fundamentals. Going forward, the reason that the paper recommends a whole of government beyond Earth migration working group is that it is our feeling.
Courtney,
Yeah.
if I could, maybe it's a good time for me to share the slides and you can
Oh,
jump
that would
right
be
into
wonderful. Sure.
Let's
Please.
just jump right into that. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see here. Let me share that.
And
You
Bob,
can continue.
same thing with John, but Bob, don't hesitate to interrupt me as I'm going through it.
Oops. Apologize for that. Looks like I got the
We'll make it real. We'll go through it really. I do encourage people. Obviously, I have a vested interest, but it's a 12th page, and really a lot was packed into it. A lot of it, frankly, representing thinking that Bob has had over a period of time, and it was a real pleasure working with him on it. There's also an appendix where, based on our respective chairing of interagency groups, we actually broke out a division of labor, if you will, among the various agencies. So that's the rather lumpy, awkward title. But in essence, it's, hey, you've got this market-driven, organically driven, yes, with government support, ecosystem, laying the groundwork for Beyond Earth migration, and it's moving very, very rapidly. How does the government avoid being left behind? And Bob gave you a couple of references as suggestions as to John. The vice president made a very explicit reference to the need to write these rules of the road. And as you read that quote, Bob and I were very specific in our paper in saying that, yes, the government should play an active role, but in no shape or form are we looking to the government to either control or own these rules of the road. So for us, it's very much a market-driven approach. Reframing the Artemis Moon Program. It is our feeling that, with all due respect to the agencies and the government that supported the overall Artemis initiative a few years ago, that in a sense they missed an opportunity, that it came across as sort of a technocratic, bureaucratic agenda. Look, Bob and I don't know about John, blue collar, right? We come from working backgrounds. And the fact is that I think most of America felt disenfranchised from this sort of inside the Beltway. And our feeling was that that this is an extraordinary opportunity to tell the American folks that, very consistent with our history as pioneers, pathfinders, that this is an audacious and incredible step toward permanent presence, in this case on the moon and leading beyond into other planets, whatever your preference, Mars, whatever. Huge deal, and ought to be framed accordingly. Beyond Earth Working Group, as Bob alluded, there's already a lot of law, a lot of regulations. And the first and foremost, we believe, is to go out and inventory what those respective authorities and rules and so forth that are with these different agencies, to make sure that there is consistency and there is alignment. we can't emphasize enough that in the private commercial world, certainty, as Bob said, stability, predictability is really critical to the business world, to the investment world. And we really believe that although this administration deserves credit for some of their leaning forward initiatives in the world of cislunar and so forth, that we might be better served as a community to have this sort of whole of government approach as well. The next slide. I think I've already talked about that. It would involve all the cabinet. I don't want to dwell on that. And again, we get into more detail in the paper. And the scope of it, again, international defense, security, regulatory, finance, government procurement, conflict resolution, as Bob's alluded to, and of course, rules of the road. Every agency really has a role in this, from agriculture to interior to you name it. And it's not just a NASA. You know, for us, the Commerce Department has the mandate to promote and advance a business. NASA certainly has a role technically, but we see, frankly, Commerce chairing it and NASA having a significant but more of a vice chair role, if you will, with this whole government approach. Bob, anything you think I've missed before we get to your part of it? And this I'll defer to you, Bob, the fast track. Sorry, Bob, you're on mute.
No, I think there's only one real one footnote I'd like to make to this, is that when people see a working group inside government, they think, I've seen a comment here earlier, glacial movement associated with that. I would not disagree with that. The reason that our working group in the Reagan administration went in 18 months from NASA does everything to NASA does nothing in terms of commercial was because of Challenger and the pressure associated with Challenger. We had to make a decision. When people don't realize it, Reagan canceled 82 commercial transportation contracts on the shuttle to create a market. So there was no market for private sector launchers until he did that. He did that, and he also barred NASA from being a competitor with now Elon Musk and others like him. But it only took us 14 months. But that was 14 months of an interagency working group of every cabinet department who was involved to get the president to issue 6 words. 6 words. So there has to be another sense of urgency. And our urgency didn't come from the Commerce Department. Our urgency came from the private sector. It came from the Chamber of Commerce, from the National Association of Manufacturers, NFIB, the Business Roundtable, going to the Secretary of Commerce and saying, we want to do, if you do this for us, we will do this for you. We'll show up. And they did.
And that's very critical, Steve, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we also recommend an advisory group, if you will, made up, populated by those groups that starting with the U.S. Chamber that Bob referred to, because that indeed is the catalyst, as Bob is saying. So Bob and I are the last people on the surface of the planet that would rely on the bureaucracy per se. It's got to be market driven.
Well, it is a great plan. I do encourage folks to read through the details. Obviously, we can't do that here. But Courtney, I'm sure folks are wondering, what chance really does this type of comprehensive proposal have in the current environment or being implemented anytime in the next 5 years or so? Well, on that,
let me repeat that the proverbial genie is unleashed. The entrepreneur, the intrapreneur within larger companies, the entrepreneurs within America and overseas are unleashed. So there's no turning back from that. And if anything, I'm finding that our friends in the Pentagon and NASA and other agencies are in many ways playing catch up. The FCC playing catch up in terms of putting out the appropriate rules to help ensure that certainty that Bob talked about. So it's happening as we speak. The question is, can the government get its act together quickly enough? My own tortured experience is that, of course, as Bob says, it takes outside pressure, right? And you need to socialize over a period of time. I mean, I recall back in 1980, a number of us was starting on what became the Commercial Space Launch Act 4 years later. And it was people like Bob and others in the government that were receptive. At that time, I was working for a rocket company who gave us a positive reception to, okay, what do you need? What do we need to do? And I think that I'm seeing more and more a critical mass in the commercial industry bringing their demands, frankly, to the door of government. But breaking through the noise signal ratio with the United States, a government as complex as the U.S. government is non-trivial. And I point to you, John. U.S. Chamber is a critical portal, if you will, a critical source of leverage in getting that level of response.
Right, and I do think that, and I do agree that we need to, as you say, just socialize this, get it, and we need this kind of change, this transformation, so that yes, it's happening. So that the horses are out of the barn to a large extent, but but you not only want those horses kind of going in the right directions, but you also want to make room for as many horses as possible so that everyone feels comfortable. Let's get the saddles, let's get the buggies. So if I'm stretching that metaphor, I hope I'm not. But let's take a right turn right now, because this is something that came up from John in our discussions. We are about to face a fiscal challenge in terms of the debt ceiling is coming up. We may be defaulting on that. There may be sequestration. There may be all sorts of financial implications of what is that? What if we do have that kind of an environment? And granted, there's no certainty in terms of the fiscal future. How does that impact the space commerce community, and in particular the prospects for a space migration future? So John, I'm going to let you handle that. Before you answer that, I do want to say we're then going to immediately go into taking some questions from the audience. So any questions, by all means, start putting them in there. But John?
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. I think the chamber, the highest leadership levels here, talking with members from across every, industry in the United States, there is concern, right, that this, the negotiations, the discussion around the debt ceiling could cause, very significant problems to our, the country's economic standing. And within the debt ceiling, there's all sorts of discussions that will go on around the budget and how we are going to proceed, in funding the government this year and the next several years. And, the House Republican Conference is committed to balancing the budget within 10 years. So what does that mean? And, according to numbers that are out there, that would require today's dollars, $14 trillion in deficit reduction. And, if you protect the Department of Defense, the VA, Social Security, Medicare, how does that impact programs like space, that support this growing industry? So I think, from the space portfolio at the chamber, we want, again, lawmakers and policymakers to understand that they have a tremendous economic opportunity here for the United States. And as we have these discussions about balanced budgets, funding the government, we don't want to upset the momentum that we built and is really picking up over the last 5 to 10 years here. And so, any concerns about a CR, sequestration, a government shutdown has impacts on the business community. With a shutdown, vendors, manufacturers won't get paid on their contracts. So the chamber is going to be very active, again, talking to Congress and the administration to do their jobs. Congress is charged with funding the government. Negotiate in good faith with your partners, both sides of the aisle, and get us budget 2, as Bob said, and really is, I think a key fact here is to give business certainty so that we can grow and get, achieve our goals with which Courtney and Bob have laid out in their paper.
Mm-hmm. Great. Bob, do you want to address that as well or add to that?
No, I agree with John. Yeah, we're in a really interesting set of what I call circumstances right now. Let's not go back to the 80s. Let's go back to 2012, 13, 14 and sequestration. Let's look at that. That's within everybody's memory. All of a sudden, large aerospace defense companies discovered commercial because there wasn't a defense bill. And they approached it like they would, and a lot of them failed at it because they didn't know anything about commercial, and so they had to learn it. And then as soon as the big defense budget started to come back, they ditched it. They got rid of it. That's just good basic behavior from a business model standpoint. We're entering a point where every one of us knows that the party's over in terms of government funding for stuff, and that we got to get serious on the budget. Put that to one side. What does that mean? NASA's stuck at 27 billion, roughly, some of that plus or minus a couple of bucks. When you run all the NASA Gantt charts out that they have, they can't go to the moon and sustain it. Because just like the ISS, they could build the ISS, but they can't sustain it. So that's why they're getting rid of it. They are a wonderful R&D shop. They are a terrible management shop, and they shouldn't be in that business. So what's happening is, I think very cleverly, the private sector, because cost of access to space has dropped, strength of sensors on small sats has increased, the number of small sat producers has increased. No longer is it something I have to have a NASA program to do this. I can go do a CubeSat and throw it up and see how it works. Access to space is becoming more democratized, both in the US and worldwide. This is the chance for the private sector to get out in front of the space agencies, get out in front financially, investment-wise, et cetera, so that the agencies are, whether they like it or not, compelled to buy services, not to build infrastructure. And we hit that inflection point, there's no going back. That's it. No going back. And I think we're there. I think for the community, the young people who are involved in these programs, and the fact that people are young enough and excited enough not to worry about all the problems, because they'll figure it out on their way. There'll be consolidation in this industry. There'll be bankruptcies in the industry. Those are green shoots. That shows a healthy industry. Don't be afraid of it. But the uncertainty is the one that comes from the government in its last cold dead hand, trying to hang on to some relevancy here. And I got to tell you, I think we're at that point, and it needs people who are attending this conference and other conferences like it to get motivated to start picking up that theme.
Right. And I agree with you, Bob, 100%. It's a matter of roles, right? So government isn't disappearing. It's a matter of, what is the appropriate role, and with a minimal touch on the on commerce, we could see this explosion continue.
And I must just add to that.
Yeah, I want to go to questions, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly, because I do want to get to questions. There have been some fabulous questions put in the chat room. Is that a number of us have been around long enough to live through a whole bunch of presidential commissions and task forces and all that, looking at the future of space. And they're often looking at, what is NASA? What is the future role of NASA? We don't need that anymore, because you're actually in the midst, I would venture to say, of if I could use that overused term, phrase, inflection point, where there's so much going on that in many ways is outside the control of government, that it's an exciting time. I also want to warn the younger people, this is, to use the cliche, this is not for the faint-hearted. We're going to have ups and downs. There are going to a lot of people had, welcome. Academics call it a correction, and those of us like Bob and me call it trauma in when you go through these situations. The other thing, quickly, let you get to questions. One of the comments was, hey, migration is conveying a sense that we're sort of leaving Earth behind, and maybe a negative connotation. Far from it. I think all of us involved with this mission view it as very much a synergistic between the benefits of going out and benefiting the Earth. And Bob himself is involved, for example, in a venture, we won't get into details, but Cis Lunar, and it's very much a benefit to the Earth. And I could go on and on with a bunch of different, so we don't view this as zero sum on the slightest. So with that, I'll go to
that's an important and ongoing conversation, and especially in the public mind, where you're seeing constantly books and articles that are chastising these rich rocket boys and leaving the world behind. Really nothing. We are a growing ecosystem, and that's going to include and enhance life on Earth, not in any way diminish it as we move out. That's an ongoing conversation. But let me pull a question here, and I'll leave it up to either any of you. You know, how does the contested space domain with space threats and debris threats impact the space commerce community? You know, these are fundamental issues that have to be resolved if we're going to have that robust space economy that we're talking about. So how do we address, you know, what are our thoughts and thinking on that? In either Bob or John, any of you who wants to jump in.
You can come up with 50 good reasons why you don't go and do business in space. And out of those 50 reasons, you can then spend some really good time with some smart people and then prioritize the risks. At the end of the day, you either go or you don't go. It's a market decision, it's a capital decision. And if you're worried about debris fields, you're going to be worried about debris fields for the rest of your life. If you're worried, because they're not going to be able to clean up all this crap overnight. And if you wait, you're going to be my age by the time you get your CubeSat up. So that's a risk factor, right? It's a risk factor. But there are so many creative people in this country and around the world that can help you address the risk factor and then put it into context. A CubeSat is 70 kilograms, right? We got a lot of real estate out there. If you want to put it up, there are a bunch of people who build it for you. If you have a decent business case, you can raise some money on it. There's nothing that I know of that would keep you restricted down here unless you first of all look at all the challenges and not the benefits first.
Mm-hmm. Let me go on to that. That's a great answer. I don't, and I couldn't do any better than that. Let me move on to another, because I want to try to get as many of these as we can get in here. Interesting question. What would the rules of the road be for territory of future settlements? Can the U.S. or any state have territory on, say, the moon? Now we're getting into we're getting to the rights, the property rights in space. So, Courtney, you want to take that one?
Actually, I hate, Bob, to have you
Bob is the expert.
No,
monopolize, but you wrote this brilliant case study.
Now let John do this. I'm overexposed right now, so let John do it.
Well, but if John, after you're done, Bob, you wrote this brilliant case study. It's on our website, I believe, right? On data right, property mining on the moon last December. That gets into some of that. Go ahead, John.
Sure. No, I would say, I've been here working in this role, for about 6 months now. And to be honest, the discussion, that immersed with the members and like day to day is probably too tactical, right? About spectrum allocation and, mission authorization and what should the FAA do. And we need to be having these larger discussions about property rights and how we're going to do commerce in space more broadly. And that's what we need to advocate again with the Hill and the administration. Obviously, they're talking about and thinking about it to some degree, but we have to move the conversation upstream to really figure out, because the Chinese are doing that, right? They are sort of picking out their spots on the moon, and other countries are as well. And so again, we have a lot of those frameworks and legal processes in place. How then do we move this to this new space domain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well said.
Mm-hmm. Well said, indeed. Bob, do you want to try to answer that?
No, my only comment is that there's so many different forums who want to talk about this, that this forum is just one other forum that's discussing it. The biggest way you're going to get focus, right? That leads us is through investment certainty and now relevancy, is that either the Senate Commerce Committee or the House Commerce Committee or those working groups on those respective committees actually take this up on a hearing. Take it up on a hearing. Nothing focuses somebody more than testimony in front of a congressional panel. And that's a green shoot to me, to see the congressional, whether it's Republican or Democrat, they all have constituencies who want to do this kind of work. They say, this is important enough to take up some of our legitimate committee time to explore. Let's explore all these topics. So it's not a webinar, it's actually testimony. And bring in the institutions that are broadly responsible for this. Bring in the chamber and bring in the other institutions that can speak to it and have them tell us on behalf of their membership what they want done. And that's including going into seeing Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Transportation. I realize that's DC speak, it's Beltway talk, but it really generates what would be the environment, because when you do have a focus event, everybody's informed. They understand what the issues are and they can move. And I really still think that the committees think the world revolves around NASA's budget. And I, you know.
Well, it is interesting that we are, Courtney, we're up on the Hill talking to some Hill folks and on the House Science Committee that oversees NASA. It was an interesting comment that there's a little bit of frustration that other committees want to have all sorts of oversight on space-related matters, which I take that as a good thing, right? That there's this, folks are very interested in many levels, whether it's national security, whether it's commerce, whether it's FCC, whatever it is, there's a great deal of interest in that regard.
Steve, John, go ahead, John.
Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Courtney. No, I just wanted to add to Bob's comments. Also, I think we as a business community need to push the vice president and the president to use the bully pulpit too. Going back to Courtney's point about Artemis being a missed opportunity. Now, I grew up in Buffalo, Steel Town. The thing that really gets me excited is that, you know, Planet was building this very high manufacturing, very high tech piece of equipment. The opportunities, you know, that people will make different decisions about why they want to migrate off planet or go off planet, but that from a business opportunity, the economic opportunity, explaining that to the American people, you know, what's available on the moon that could, again, enhance quality of life back here on Earth is really important. And, you know, the whole of government needs to tell that story better.
Yeah, and Steve, just very quickly, the whole of government, hot off the press, is that the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, John Bloom, said that he's going to be working with the Pentagon to put out a non-classified document on what the Pentagon is doing to protect space assets. Well, to the point that we made in the paper, yeah, through their knothole, through the very critical national security knothole, that's critical. But again, it's another reason why we need to have this whole of government approach, so that everybody is properly coordinated. So I just wanted to put that out there as a data point.
Excellent. I want to acknowledge Scott Cassingham for offering the question on property rights in space. And then Alan DeLuna actually has an interesting question, really challenging us, the idea of creating this whole of government working group, which could move, as he says, glacially. He says you need small group teams with definitive metrics and short time limits, and he feels that would be a better approach. I'm curious what your response would be, Courtney, to that.
Well, as we know, those of us who lived and died on the interagency field, it all depends on your terms of reference, right? So you can actually do, I've done it, Bob has proven you can do it. You can bring sort of the cast of Ben-Hur, if you will, but do it in a way that's properly focused, orchestrated, with very thought through milestones and deliverables. So it can be done, and it has been done. And at the end of the day, it takes political will and so forth to do it, but it can be done. We have an existence proof for that.
Mm-hmm.
If I can add one thing, when I was at FBI, I worked on CFIUS, and I was so impressed. You know, the FBI couldn't decide on what the 3 aspects of a fitness test. It took them years to figure that out and put out policy. But CFIUS made a decision, you know, on a merger acquisition within a 60-day time frame, right? Every time Treasury led that, all the representative agencies had input, but they came to a conclusion. And I think that process works fantastically perhaps for some of these tactical issues like the various agency regulators. But I do think, on the bigger issues, property rights, some of these things that we haven't tackled yet, it would require some whole of government participation and effort.
That's a good point. Excellent. I do want to advise people we are scheduled to go till quarter after the hour. So, and I do see that questions are piling up, comments are piling up. Is it interesting? John J has asking, are the changes needed in the Outer Space Treaty? It's always good in this kind of conversation to talk about international law. Would there be further thoughts with relation to the Outer Space Treaty and property rights?
Yeah, I'll jump on that. I don't know how long it took the Outer Space Treaty to be negotiated, but anything you're going to do in the international community climate, particularly today, less in the 80s or the 60s or the 90s, particularly today, I think is going to take a decade. And unfortunately, the question of property rights is not going to wait a decade. You've already really the first publicly exercised statement of property rights, and it's worth as an example. Are the Japanese are going to put a lander on the moon here shortly, within the next couple of weeks, and on board will be a payload that'll have a little tiny shovel like you have at the beach, and I overstate that, but it'll stick it into the regolith, it'll flip it into a container, it'll seal the container, and it'll mark it sold to NASA, and it won't bring it back, it'll just leave it there on the moon, and then NASA will have then just proven that it can buy resources from a commercial company. Now, A, it was a Japanese company. B, a Japanese licensed lander or payload. C, I think the lander is Intuitive Machines, so that may be a US platform. D, NASA can't buy anything from anybody if it doesn't comply with the FARs, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. So when you talk about property rights, what's missing here? They're going to pay them for it. I don't know what the number is, but they're going to pay him for it. And then NASA's going to say, I own that now. So on the one hand, I think it's really creative and it's kind of overlooked. What part of that violates the Outer Space Treaty? A, for smarter lawyers, or B, even if it does, who cares? Where's the victim? Who has, in the Latin, there's a phrase called dominum non injuri, meaning, in other words, you don't have a claim if you don't have a provable injury. In this case, who's injured by it? So I think this thing about the Outer Space Treaty, as well as the Moon Agreement, et cetera, only sets us up for a different problem. And I'll just say it, the Antarctica Agreement. If you want to treat the moon as Antarctica, then start planning on doing your building for commercial purposes on Mars, because you won't be able to do it on the moon. We cannot afford an Antarctic type convention relative to the moon. It has to be more laissez-faire. And ironically, I'm sitting here right now telling you, NASA's led the way in that. Now, I have to admit, I looked in the FARs and I tried to find out what FAR regulation they used to buy it, and I just quit looking. But the point is, it had to comply with the FARs, so there is rules already in place.
Okay. Let's talk about China. You mentioned China. So let's, Cynthia Levinson asks, to what extent are China's actions in the South China Sea, for instance, indicative of what they might do on the moon? Can they be friendly competitors, or is it going to be a adversarial relationship as they move to develop the moon, and we do as well?
China's a bad actor, and China has already, if you look at bad actors, are defined by the things that they have done, and then you project what they will do. So when you look at what they've done in and around the moon, they've gone to the dark side of the moon, and they've also started to replicate infrastructure around to support that station on that facility on the moon that they want to build. Why are they going there instead of on the lit side of the moon? Because they want to, it's not so much they want to do it in private, it's just they want their own domain. And that's really what this is going to come down to. I've said this on LinkedIn before, this is not unusual. This is a way we ran the 19th century when it came to imperialism, colonialism, and expansionism. And the only way it can be railed in is with an equivalent strong security force to make sure that international norms are respected. And even notwithstanding that, you still have the South China Sea, where they've lost every case at the World Court. So China's a bad actor. They've acted badly previously. They're going to act bad in the future. And you have to have an equivalent security force to be able to confront it. Now, that may be, as one person in the chat said, this could be our challenger moment. China could be our challenger moment. And I thank him for that comment, because that is right. It could be.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would say, as we say in the paper, humanity is going to bring its good, bad, and ugly baggage with us. There's nothing magical about the Kármán line. And as retired General John Hayton mentioned a few years back during a talk, it's just the nature of humanity. And in this case, we're talking China, but it's just a general human. People are going to steal. People are going to do wonderful, beautiful, majestic things. But there has to be a place for adjudicating and enforcement. And as we're trying to say in the paper, and you've heard from Bob and John, we have a lot of practice at that for the last several millennia here on Earth, in particular in the West. There's a lot of extrapolation we can do from what we've already done here on Earth.
Mhm. I think, and I'm looking at David Chevron's comments, a good friend in the Houston area. And he's talking about NASA's efforts to understand the use of in situ research resources on the moon and so forth. And their efforts are fairly modest. So Beyond Earth, we're always looking. Are there areas that we should be, investing? Go ahead and investing those government dollars so that we better understand different aspects of utilizing the space resources, such that that information could be useful to the private sector in one way or the other. I'm just curious if any of you have an opinion about that. Certainly ISR utilization, or or research, or any other sort of related technology gap closing efforts at NASA. Courtney, or
I'm really not quite sure how to.
Yeah, no, I know. I just think it's an interesting topic, and we don't, because part of the challenge, even the commercial sector. Bob, you talk about the iSpace mission to the moon, and that technology is just very formative, right? How do we, even just understanding how to get to the moon, how to utilize those resources, how to manipulate those materials, and eventually we'll want to take those materials and we'll want to refine them, and it will require certain understandings about how equipment is going to actually behave in the lunar vacuum environment, 1/6 gravity, and so forth. So there really is, we do need to respect the fact that that there's a lot of knowledge that yet needs to be gained as we start to build out this economy, especially as we move beyond the Earth-focused satellite or robotics. NASA continues to play a big role in that, and they could be playing, in many ways, a bigger role to seeding and promoting this. And iSpace is a great example. NASA said we'll buy samples for whoever can get to the moon and scoop up some resources. And that's a great, how do we expand on that kind of thinking?
Yeah, don't get, others might put words in my mouth. Don't get me wrong about that. NASA to me is a national treasure. I mean, it's a jewel, and JPL included, and the federal labs that support it. We have something that is no other country in the world has. We need to protect it a little bit better, but basically it's unique. It is, however, when we move it from its core missions and put mandated missions on it, which are more popular as opposed to practical, you blow their budget up. Your people can't basically execute. It's mundane work, that sort of thing. So there has to be this defined bridge between R&D and applied. NASA does R&D, which includes exploration, and they prove you can get there. Mm-hmm. I have a conversation with a national official one time who told me that what we want to do in Cislunar, she was in shock. She said, that is really hard, what you're talking about. No, I'm not kidding. That's really hard. And I went, yeah. And she said, we practice that. We practice that for months before we do it. How do you expect to do that? And I said, well, we'll just hire some of your people. And that's the point. NASA's a place to go shop for people. And they carry that lot. That's a huge amount of invested capital in those people. That capital, human capital, is incredibly valuable. And yes, you put them to group with people who have aspirations and people who have knowledge and people who have capital. That's all you need.
We never want to diminish the potential and value of NASA going forward. With that, wonderful though, Bob. With that, we're coming on the 15-minute mark. I do want to give you all the last word, if you will. Any last comments and before we sign off? So how about Courtney, John, and Bob?
Well, let me just add an addendum about NASA. When Bob and I were dealing with the agency back in the 80s, it is profoundly different today. Now, the institution still has some inertia, like any bureaucracy. There's some legacy, but there's some wonderful, true change agents. I almost call them warriors in the forefront in the agency headquarters and different field centers. So I do want to applaud them. We've had some of them as speakers on previous webinars. The other thing I want to say quickly about the Washington Compact, I do encourage everyone to read it. It is an effort by non-government people to provide a frame for those of us in the private sector to begin to grapple with what are the gaps, what are the voids left with these various sundry international agreements, come to agreement when it comes to heritage sites on the moon and so forth to protect them. And it becomes a frame within which a living document that we can, through market experience, add and revise, if you will, over time. So I wanted to indicate that's the importance of that document.
Great. John, any closing thoughts for us?
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I thought it was important to bring up some of the concerns around the budget and the debt ceiling, but I think Bob really took it and really expressed and demonstrated the opportunity that we have in front of us in the very short term to make some incredible gains. And I think, if we can get government to be more of a facilitator than to be the center of gravity for all this activity and be a partner with industry and examining the risk, figuring out how we're going to live with the risk and giving, people, inventors, entrepreneurs, people with, who want to migrate the opportunity to seize that, then I think we will move the discussion in a good place.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, John. And Bob, any final thoughts for us?
No, this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. This is the beginning of a process going off planet, not the end. There's going to be broken glass, fortunes made, people upset. It's so exciting. Certainly for me at my age to see this happening, and because it's not just for my children, my grandchildren and their children. It's just fun of being a part of it. So I'm, contrary to some people's opinion, I am very optimistic.
That's a great note. Be very optimistic and to say that this is the beginning of a conversation, or it's an ongoing conversation at the Beyond Earth. We can't cover everything in an hour and 15 minutes, but hopefully what we've done is we've teed up a number of issues and conveyed some understanding about what the challenges are facing us as we try to align public policy such that it will allow us for the greatest possible growth and development in space and to ultimately to lead to the human migration there. So with that, thank you all. Thank you, Courtney, John, and Bob. Thank you so much. At this point, I want to hand it over to Sean Hadley to sign us off.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve and Courtney. I cannot thank you and John and Bob for what a fascinating conversation. And as Bob mentioned, just the beginning of a conversation. You know, the highlights from today were too much to summarize in 30 seconds, but I just want to, give a shout out to Bob for his one-word answers, investment, certainty, relevance. Courtney for talking about the unleashing of private capital and also for sharing his impressive background in government, and John for only 6 months at the chamber, already jumping in with both feet to share his needed cogent perspective for business. We're really looking forward to your continued engagement, John. It's so necessary in this conversation. So we were just thrilled. I mean, look, in 2022 alone, we had 42 people go to space, give or take. We saw the most successful orbital launches for a second year in a row, another new record. So we need this commitment from experts like Bob, like John, like Courtney to help us shape this vision. We are going. It has been unleashed, right? As the proverbial genie, as Courtney mentioned, is at the bottom. So we need this help to make that permanent human presence in space be a success. So with Beyond Earth, we are committed to this mission. We want these economically vibrant communities for the benefit of all humanity, which I think was a key point of today's discussion. And we know these rules are really needed to help us to get there. So in terms of supporting our mission, please, if you didn't get a chance, make a donation at beyondearth.org. I want to thank all of you for being here today and for all of our supporters. And we really look forward to seeing you soon. And we're going to sign off the webinar now.
Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.